Hello, this is the Green Report Rappers podcast on the environment and the stories of people whose decisions impact the world around us. I'm G. Geronimo, and of course, this is Iya Gozum. Hi, Iya.
Hi.
And for our last episode for 2022, we invited John Leo Algo, or JL, one of Raptor's contributors, who writes op-ed pieces on the climate and environment. He's also Deputy Executive Director for Programs and Campaigns of Living Laudato Si Philippines and a member of the Interim Secretariat of Action Klima Pilipinas. JL was a civil society delegate at the recently concluded COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. So we invited him. Naisipan namin na he would be the perfect guest to talk to post-COP. So for this episode, we will be talking about what happened at the COP27 conference. Lest we forget, di ba, there was a decision, but ang pinaka naging highlight was also the loss and damage fund, which we will be discussing later on. Pero let's invite now JL, rather. Hi, JL. Kamusta?
Good day to you, G and Iya, and a good day to all the listeners of this program.
Okay. Because we have a lot of questions to ask this today, we'll just go right into the first question. So, of course, one of the stories out of COP27 was the leadership shakeup among the Philippine delegation. And we were reporting that from the Philippines, but you guys were on the ground and you were seeing how that was happening. So what did that look like there on the ground? And for you, ano kaya yung pwedeng ginawa pa ng government, I don't know, before or during COP27, so that we could have represented the Philippines in COP27 better?
Well, I think it started from a bit of a conflict in scheduling because usually COPs take place, at least in recent years, around the late November to early December. But this year's COP in Egypt occurred basically on the first half of November, which coincides with the typical time of the year when Congress here in the Philippines deliberates on next year's national budget. So the presence, of course, of department heads are needed back in the Philippines so that they may be able to present their cases about what their respective departments and agencies need in terms of the budget for the next 12 months. And that is very relevant because two department heads uh, were at COP27 in person. That would be the DNR Secretary, Maria Antonia Yulo Loizaga, who was also the head of the COP27 Philippine delegation, and Climate Change Commission Vice Chairperson, Secretary Robert Borge. So both of them were at COP27, uh, of course, given their mandates as well and the relevance of climate action in their respective national agencies. And that's one of the reasons, actually, that's the main reason why both of them have to go home to the Philippines in the midst of COP27. Of course, for us that were in Egypt when we heard the news, given, of course, the circumstances surrounding their departure in person, of course, it did not exactly give the Philippines a strong image in terms of decisive leadership. Because, of course, we understand again the importance of uh, settling the national budget issues. And of course, what happens at COP doesn't really matter if you cannot translate the gains from the negotiations into national and local actions. So we definitely understand that. But given the circumstances and of course the anticipation, for me it's impossible that the Philippine government, at least those that were part of the delegation, did not see that coming. That could be some scheduling conflicts. So the fact that that happened, we understand why there was a leadership shakeup, as you would call it, but it nevertheless made our position at the global level look weak.
Mm-hmm.
And we should also note that, of course, that doesn't mean that just because Secretary Loizaga and Secretary Borge went home, that doesn't mean that they did not pay attention to COP. We are aware that there is also a support staff here in the Philippines. I believe they call it the Manila Hub per the delegation, who provides 24/7 support to those that were in Egypt. And of course, there are instructions as well that were left behind by uh, Secretary Borges, Secretary Loizaga, And of course, they are also having Zoom meetings as well. So they definitely stayed in touch. But optics wise, I would say it really did not help our position at the global level. And I don't, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't think Senator Lauren Legarda calling out the two other climate change commissioners uh, really helped that particular issue, if to be honest
Mhm.
with you.
Mhm. How about Philippine Ambassador to Egypt, Ezedin Taro? His performance at COP27. Is there anything that you can say about it? Did he represent, after the leaders already left for the Philippines, how did he represent the Philippines at COP27?
Well, again, based from what we know, for those of us that were in Egypt, Ambassador Tago, I don't think he has as much of a climate expertise the way Secretary Loizaga or Secretary Borge would have. But his years of experience, of course, in terms of diplomacy in Egypt, especially engaging with the COP27 presidency, we cannot underestimate that kind of significance or that kind of function because the climate negotiations, it's not just about, of course, it's primarily about addressing the climate crisis. So, to some degree, you need to have a level of knowledge about the issues and solutions, especially at the global and national context. But at the same time, there are also certain factors that needs to be considered, like of course the politics, especially in the
Mhm.
home country, and that's where his experience as an ambassador, specifically within Egypt, really played a big role. So in theory, of course, in practice, it's hard to assess specifically uh, about his overall performance because if we're going to base the so-called success of COP27 in terms of strictly the what happened with the decision text, which of course is reasonable, uh, then we can say that pretty much the entire all of the parties that were present, quote unquote, underperformed because aside from the loss and damage aspect, there, as you mentioned earlier, that was the main highlight, but there wasn't really much progress elsewhere. So
Mhm.
we will have to, uh, not saying that we will have to grade in scale or in a curve rather, but instead we should take into consideration, as I mentioned, the other circumstances that uh, influenced the Philippine delegation's performance at COP27. And given all that, I would say that while Ambassador Tago did a decent job as the head of the delegation in person in Egypt, there certainly is a lot of room for improvement overall when it comes to this kind of coordination within the Philippine delegation because it definitely did not make our position look stronger.
Mhm. Speaking of the COP decision, ano ba yung wins and losses at COP27? Maybe also specifically for the Philippines, but even for the global South, what are our wins and losses at COP27?
Of course, let's get the elephant in the room out of the way: the loss and damage funding facility, the establishment of it. It's important to understand that this did not just start last year, because what happened in Glasgow at the last year's climate negotiations is the group of developing countries proposed to establish said funding facility. But of course, developed nations rejected that, and instead they wanted to have a more, for lack of a better term, detailed discussion on the terms of how this funding facility would proceed, which led to the establishment of what we call the Glasgow Dialogues. And that took place earlier this year. And actually,
Mhm.
it's supposed to be, I believe, a 2 year process. So we can expect that to continue. And that becomes very important as well, because as I mentioned, the funding facility was officially recognized that it needs to be established in the COP27 decision text. And it did not just happen overnight. It did not just happen within the span of a year. This is a result of nearly 3 decades of struggle, 3 decades of constant, nonstop, passionate advocacy by developing countries, the most vulnerable communities. We have been clamoring for this for so long. And nevertheless, even though there are not yet any specifics as to what this funding facility could be or will be, because again, that would be the subject of future negotiations, whether at the official COP or during the intersessionals in between. It's still a big victory for the most vulnerable communities, for developing countries, and of course, the global climate justice movement. That is a very big win, not just for the Philippines, of course, but for us in the Philippines, that is a tremendous step forward. And we need to
Right.
keep the momentum going in future negotiations.
How about, is there, are there things that we were expecting, the losses at COP27, that we did not really get a decision, was did not make it to the decision, to the final decision?
Man, where do we begin with that? There's quite a lot of them,
Maybe the
actually.
biggest one, or like the most crucial one that advocates have been pushing for.
Um, if you're asking like in the global context, because I believe what I'm about to say is very different from the global context to
Mm-hmm.
at least what has been the policy direction in the Philippines over the past few years. So just to answer that question, I believe one of the biggest losses involves the scaling up or enhancing efforts against fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
Use, loss and damage is the big win, but it's not for me the only highlight of COP27. The other highlight involves the discussions or the debates, the very intense debates on what to do with mitigation, specifically about fossil fuels. Last year, again, in Glasgow, in the decision text, it was specifically stated that countries will pursue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane, among other kinds of pollution. And there was a very specific language there that states countries agreed to phase down unabated coal fired power plants and to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Of course, the original language to that is supposed to be more stringent, stronger. Of course, many developing countries, especially small island developing states, for example, they would love to see the language of phasing out all kinds of fossil fuels, which of course many CSOs as well worldwide, even of course us in the Philippines in the CSO ranks, we also would like to see a stronger language as well on that particular aspect. But such is the nature of conferences of parties and negotiations. I mean, there are nearly 200 parties, 200 different national interests, and you combine that with thousands of non-state interests there from civil societies, even businesses. Uh, so these quote unquote compromises are expected. But of course, that doesn't make our mission easier, especially when it comes to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, hopefully even lower. And that is one of the most important goals under the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, at COP27, what happened was, while India again tried to make a stronger push to include all fossil fuels in terms of the phase down or phase out,
Mm-hmm.
what happened was instead there is no scaling up of ambition. There is no enhancement of the goal. The language stayed almost exactly the same, which is of course uh, a bit of a disappointment because the science is very clear. You need to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius if we want to avoid further loss and damage, if we want to avoid even more extreme climate change impacts on food insecurity, water shortages, those kinds of impacts. We want to avoid that. And you cannot do that without drastically reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. And just to finish on this note,
Mm-hmm.
we note that the Philippine delegation did not have a strong statement in support of a stronger language
Mm-hmm.
against fossil fuels, which is sort of consistent with the current administration's policy direction of promoting the use of natural gas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually, this diluted language is the source of frustration for many advocates and lobbyists, no? Actually, isa pa dito, a lot of advocates and activists are demanding for more space. During our pre-COP interview, yung interview namin, he said na there's a shrinking space for civil society. And kita naman to when climate advocate Greta Thunberg did not attend because of this shrinking space, no? What do you think about this? Can third world advocates afford to be absent in this huge event?
Um, Again, this is just my personal opinion. When we talk about recent COPs, for me, I do not see it strictly as just about the negotiations anymore. Because if you look at the profile of who attends the COPs in recent years, almost it's almost a 50-50 split between official government delegations and non-state actors, CSOs, businesses, academia. So to me, COPs, at least the recent ones, have also turned into an opportunity for CSOs, for businesses, for basically non-government representatives to interact with one another, to foster other kinds of opportunities and other partnerships to spur climate action without necessarily involving their respective governments or any other. Of course, we're not saying that we should just do it ourselves or do it on our own, because we cannot dispute the fact that every stakeholder, every sector needs to play a role in addressing the climate crisis. That's the point of the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities in the first place. But going back to your question about the shrinking space of civil societies, this this recent COP in Egypt for me may be the least inclusive of the recent COPs that I've seen. And it's not just about the difficulties in entering the country, the visa requirements, the expensive uh, process, of course, for traveling and all that. But even my experience, which by the way, a lot of people will agree with, based from our collective experiences in Sharm el Sheikh, the 2 week experience from commuting to the directions to the opportunities to engage. I agree with you on that. There is certainly a recent trend of shrinking inclusivity in terms of non-government participation in COPs. We remember in COP25 when there was an incident when uh, certain civil society groups were kicked out of the venue after staging an impromptu rally. Of course, there's a bit of a gray area when it comes to uh, the rationale behind them being kicked out. There's apparently they broke UNFCCC protocols, and I actually was in front of that crowd when I saw them getting kicked out back in Madrid. And then, of course, last year, of course, we understand the restrictions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. That is a little bit out of our control in comparison to what we saw in Madrid and what we saw in Sharm el Sheikh, because that's COVID, of course, is a global problem. But nevertheless, this shrinking civil society space is a big issue because you cannot address the climate crisis if you do not include the representatives of the most vulnerable sectors and communities worldwide, especially from the global south.
You mentioned earlier that so far this is the least inclusive COP. Is this a trend you see continuing for the next COPs for COP28 at Saudi and so on and so forth?
That's a good question. I don't know if I should let my optimistic side talk now or if I should just stay realistic. But in the interest of transparency for this particular green report that we are doing here, I would say that we're talking about the global perspective here, the Philippine perspective. Boy, we have a lot to talk about that. But in terms of the global, I think the UNFCCC and of course the host of next year's COP, I believe that will be the United Arab Emirates because I think COP22
Yeah.
will be in Dubai. Hopefully, I'm correct about that. But uh, they have to be the ones to really step up and influence and the decision making processes such that it will become really more inclusive because that is, I think, the last thing, one of the last things definitely that parties, COP organizers want. They don't want to have that kind of public image of being non-inclusive because it would really backfire and put the negotiations in the negative light, especially if given the current state of climate action, it keeps on lagging behind or it's not enough to address actual climate change impacts as we are observing today.
Yeah. To go back to the loss and damage fund, you mentioned earlier na this decision took decades, and as we know, Filipinos really held the line when it came to this loss and damage, to the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. Can you talk us through that, yung the entire process, and how Filipinos really were instrumental to get us to this place today?
Okay, hopefully I do this part justice, because, well, certainly it's important to remember the history. Wherever we
Mm-hmm.
go, it's important to not really to pay homage, so to speak, to our history. Uh, Definitely, the Filipino negotiators definitely played a big role in influencing the loss and damage discussions. I mean, remember back in 2013, for example, when Super Typhoon, excuse me, Yolanda hit. By the way, next year is the 10th anniversary of Yolanda, which makes loss and damage for the Philippines an even bigger issue, both at the
Yes.
national and global level. But back in 2013, when Yolanda hit or made landfall, excuse me, in eastern Philippines, COP was going on at that time. I think that
Mm-hmm.
was COP19. And I remember our colleague, then climate change commissioner and negotiator as well, Mr. Yeb Sanyo, he staged a hunger strike in protest of the lack of then action in, I believe, in Poland. That was the venue of COP19, about the lack of action on addressing loss and damage. And those two incidences certainly influenced the establishment of what we call the Warsaw International Mechanism for addressing loss and damage, which, by the way, is not the same thing as what happened in Egypt this earlier this year when they
Mm-hmm.
established the funding, because the Warsaw International Mechanism is more on providing support and administrative work when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to activities against loss and damage. So that was basically, I think, to me, the first milestone in terms of really pushing forward the momentum to make
Mm-hmm.
loss and damage a true third pillar of climate action, along with, of course, mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and of course, adaptation.
Adaptation.
Yes.
Right.
So I think that's when it started, and the momentum has been slow, but again, it culminated finally this year. But of course, that's not the end game. That's just step.
Mm-hmm.
That's just another step. We have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
steps to go.
Mm-hmm. Uh, but what does this fund now mean for the Philippines? Because of course, right now we're looking at just, diba, there will be a fund, but where do we go now from here, especially for the Philippines?
The Philippines, per the report of the Department of Finance, in the last decade, experiences 506 billion pesos of climate-related loss and damage, which, if my numbers are correct, if I remember correctly, is 98% of all kinds of loss and damage during the previous decade. That's how much the country has lost in terms
Mm-hmm.
of loss and damage because of climate change impacts. And to be honest with you, there's still a lot of communities in that have been hit by really strong storms in the previous decade that we can say are still recovering in one way or another. Because when we say loss and damage, we're not just talking about the loss of homes, the loss of livelihoods. We're also talking about mental health impacts, the loss of
Mm-hmm.
cultural heritage, those kinds of non-economic loss and damage, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And while, of course, the Philippines, uh, as I mentioned, Filipino negotiators played a big role in loss and damage in the last decade, even at COP27. But like I mentioned, even with the agreement that happened just this November to finally fund actions versus loss and damage, given the processes within the UN FCCC, it might take years to actually operationalize it, because now we're going to have to talk about how do exactly do we operationalize it? What's the structure for the for the group that's going to handle the money? Where would the money come from? Who will get prioritized? How will they disperse or provide the funding to those who need restitution the most? So for the Philippines, like I mentioned, it's important to build on what happened in Egypt and to make sure that the structure, the financial flows, the operationalization of the loss and damage funding facility is, of course, not just in the best interest of Filipinos, but also in the best interest of developing countries as well and the most vulnerable communities. Because in terms of global climate justice, our pursuit of it at least, I believe that all developing countries, all Filipinos, must share the same vision.
Mhm. But how about our new administration? We know that from last year, it's just, I guess, a honeymoon phase. They were just establishing. They were just really starting out, and of course, we had a new environment secretary. But now that we have already gone past that honeymoon phase, what can our government do, knowing that the global climate talks are going into this direction? What about the climate policies that we have here in the Philippines?
This may sound hard to believe because I'm a civil society representative, but the current administration, in terms of inclusivity, is or actually slightly better than the last few years of the previous administration. That sounds hard to believe, but it's true because even during actually the last COP in Glasgow, we actually received reports that uh, certain leaders of the Philippine delegation back then actually issued some kind of an order to strictly not engage with civil society organizations. That's how bad it was on the
Mm-hmm.
last years of the Duterte administration. At least with the current administration, there's actually already marked improvements in terms of inclusivity with civil society. That's on a relative scale. On an absolute scale, so much work needs to be done. But on a relative scale, we give credit where credit is due. There has been marked improvements already, but there can still be more to be done in terms of that inclusivity aspect. And um, we believe that the appointment of Secretary Lozaga as the DNR secretary, I think, is very important because we recognize her years of experience and her credibility in the climate and disaster risk field. That's very important, of course. We've also observed the efforts of Secretary Borje to make the CCC more inclusive as well. Again, room for improvement, but certainly a step in the right direction compared to the previous administration. But that's just on the inclusivity part. So when we're talking about, for example, other policies that our government needs to implement, uh, definitely it's about translating the gains again from COP into the national level. How do you make sure that what our negotiators, our diplomats, our representatives abroad, when they engage in these one-on-one meetings with certain countries to ask for funding, or even at COPs, when it's 200 countries arguing against one another? Because again, I like to point out that for the Philippines to implement its climate actions under its nationally determined contributions, for example, we committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 75% within the current decade. But 72.29% of that is conditional, meaning we are basing it on the fact that we are one of the most vulnerable countries, yet our contribution to the pollution is less than 1%. So therefore, we are owed finance, technologies, and capacity building. So it's all about making sure that whatever means of support and implementation we do get from developed countries or even from multilateral banks like ADB or World Bank, for example, that those funds, those technologies will not only aid our pursuit of sustainable development and, of course, strengthen our national resilience against the climate crisis, but it will also not place the burden of the costs of implementation on the most vulnerable peoples, because that would just make us hypocrites. How can a country
Mhm.
that calls for climate justice at global level commit to actions that just make the lives of its people, its citizens, even worse? That's what I would
Right.
say.
Do you think this improvement in inclusivity would be sustainable in the sense that this would extend to future COPs and even in other spaces and dialogues pertaining to climate action?
Well, as both of you mentioned, the first 6 months was a honeymoon phase of sorts. And personally, I won't even call it a honeymoon phase. I have another term in mind, but that's beside the point. My point is, uh, yeah, but again, if assuming that it really is a honeymoon phase, now we get to the real stuff. Now we get to the actual hard part of the process, because like we mentioned, and this is what I was alluding to earlier when I said the Philippine perspective is a different story altogether. Because in terms of inclusivity for civil societies here in the Philippines, in terms of what the government is doing, there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done. And in the last couple of years, actually around 2017 or around or the years before 2017, the Philippines has historically featured a large uh, what do we call it? A large group of civil society representatives as technical advisors or providing support as members of the official Philippine delegation. It was only starting around the midway part of the Duterte administration when the inclusivity or this, as you say it, the space for civil society really shrunk to almost becoming non-existent, as
Mhm.
bad as it was last year. So, uh, well, of course, as civil society, we will continue to do our duty to monitor the government's programs and projects, its climate policies, the implementation. We will continue to, of course, maintain communications because we should believe in building bridges instead of walls. But of course, that doesn't mean that we will just be blind to any shortcomings. We need to keep making sure that our leaders are accountable for any shortcomings and, of course, for all kinds of actions. And I think it's also important that we provide or offer them our support, of course, within our respective capacities. So I think uh, as much as civil society wants to continue offering its support to the government and, of course, providing constructive criticism, the government must also improve its efforts, especially at the national and local levels, to reach out to non-government stakeholders.
Okay, so speaking of the uh, next years, no, since the historic loss and damage fund was already agreed upon in COP27, what's the next big thing that we should look out for in COP28 and in the next conferences?
Well, certainly the closer we get to the year 2030, which many policymakers
Right.
have set as a deadline, not just for actually climate action, but also even for the SDGs, for example. Uh, the closer we get to 2030, the bigger the importance of mitigation will be, especially when it comes to the necessary, for science, it's necessary just transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But speaking strictly for COP28, one of the biggest issues that I see for that particular negotiations round is the global stocktake. So,
Mhm.
for the benefit of our audience here, the global stocktake, of course, is a regular process under the UNFCCC, where countries, communities, basically all stakeholders, they take into account all of the progress in climate action that has been done so far, whether it be on reducing emissions, renewable energy, energy efficiency, reforestation, adaptation, even addressing loss and damage. Uh, Youth, indigenous peoples, and everyone can make their inputs into the global stocktake. And basically, it's an assessment of what has been done so far, what has been the limitations, on a global scale, even a regional scale, depending on the perspective, and what can be done moving forward so that we can actually meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. That will be the big thing at COP28 next year. And of course, moving forward, the details of the loss and damage funding facility will also be another, as well as climate finance. Again, it's a lot of issues, but those will be the key issues that I see will be important at COP28.
Right. There's really more work to be done. We're just really starting, and the deadline is fast approaching for the climate. We really enjoyed talking to you, JL. Salamat sa pagpapaunlak, and we can't wait to read the next ed pieces you write next year, especially those on the climate. We really enjoy reading those, and they really inform our reporting here at Raptor. Salamat, JL.
Thank you as well.
Okay. Sige, before we wrap up this episode, as I said at the start of the episode, na this is actually our last for 2022, naisip ko, Iya, na we should do a fearless forecast of what 2023 will look like for the environment. O, di ba, forecast tayo. So,
Going
uh,
fearless.
oo, hindi lang forecast, fearless
That's
forecast.
correct.
So, we both prepared 3 items, di ba? So, okay lang kung malay mo magkaparehas yung item natin. Sige. So, I'll go first. So, yung una kong forecast, actually dito fearless kasi mukhang talaga namang mangyayari to, but I I foresee stronger storms in 2023, which is scary. Hindi siya fearless. It's a scary forecast because imagine if we're going to experience scarier or stronger storms in 2023 than what we already saw in the past year. Then we really have to be ready. There are places, even this year lang, there are places na hindi natin in-expect na babahain pero
Yes.
binaha, 'di ba? And mga lugar na hindi lang isang araw, hindi lang isang weekend, pero mga buwan like in Pakistan, 'di ba? So if there will be stronger storms in 2020, especially with the pace of the climate talks are not in tune with the pace of disasters and climate change itself. So yun ang aking scary
Una.
forecast. Unang fearless
Actually,
forecast for 2023.
actually ninote ko din 'yan.
Ay,
So
yes. Ano
parehas
yung sa'yo?
tayo in that regard. So siguro since na-foresee na natin 'yun and
Mhm.
science also says na mas lalakas pa nga. Uh, from our part, syempre sa newsroom, babantayan natin kung anong gagawin ng administrasyon para mas patibayin, i-adapt ang mga communities na laging apektado. At kahit nga hindi yung communities na laging apektado kasi nga, as we saw this year, may mga binahan ay hindi natin nga in-expect. So that's something na aside na sa forecast natin, ay babantayan natin for the
Mhm.
next 6 years. Lalo na this administration nga pala, no, ay nasa kanya halos yung bulk ng, well, fast approaching sa 2030. Kasi matatapos
Right,
siya ng
right.
28. So,
Tama, tama.
malaking responsibility yan. So, anyway, isa sa mga forecast ko, this is sad at napag-usapan din to kanina ay
Mhm.
I don't know if tama yung adjective ko but a drier participation in COP from civil society in the coming
Mm.
years. Kasi I would expect na frustration would build as we
Mhm.
approach 2030 and eventually civil society would try to find other venues, not to discount the importance and how critical COP is. Malaking
Mhm.
event pa rin siya. I think civil society sees naman kung gaano ka-importante na andoon. Pero
Mm.
ayun nga, maybe in the coming years it would almost become mechanical na sasama
Yeah,
doon. And
yeah.
for organic movement to grow, uh, we would have to look for other spaces, I think.
Right. So you think magiging jaded ba? Ganun ba? Parang ano na parang pang ilang cup na naman 'to. Ano na ba
Oo.
nangyayari? Oh,
Parang
sige.
ganon. Parang ganon.
Tanungin natin si JL next year.
Very negative. Parang very
Oo.
less hopeful.
Sige. Okay. Ako naman, babalik ako sa country natin. We'll know more about next year. Hopefully, we'll know more about the plans of our Environment Department and our Climate Change Commission.
Yeah.
Hindi ko, I think I can, other people can agree with me na hindi pa rin talaga natin, although we know the credentials, we know their competence, pero hindi pa rin talaga natin matansya kung kung ano yung plans and ano yung magiging policies ng ating Environment Department and ng ating Climate Change Commission. So,
Yes.
hopefully, by next year, we will know more about those things. They will be more transparent. They will want to invite, they would want to engage more the press more, no, 'di ba? Na makausap talaga natin sila at tulungan naman 'yun na what they say, what they want to do and yung mga plans nila for the environment, of course, we want to know and we want to, gusto nating bantayan yun at gusto natin makita kung mafulfill, especially given that talagang ibinida talaga ni President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. yung climate, pollution, the environment in all many of his speeches. So we'll see what will happen next year. Yun yung aking second forecast.
Second forecast. For
Oo.
me naman, di ko alam kung forecast to or wishful thinking. Pero, uh, I I hope to see more efforts in development and production of clean energy. Parang
Mm.
recently lang, today lang din yata, lumabas yung balita about the nuclear fusion energy na try ngayon sa US. So it's still a long, 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 long way to go. Pero this is the kind of dialogue na we should uh, keep talking about louder and louder
Mhm.
as we approach 2030, 2050. Ayan.
You think it will be more mainstream, kumbaga, yung discussion, or hindi na super technical?
Dapat.
Oo.
Dapat the conversation and the supply and the
Mhm.
technology mas
Right.
maging mainstream siya eventually.
At yung reach, yung access, 'di
Yeah,
ba?
yeah.
Kasi
Accessible.
ang sinasabi mahal pa, hindi pa accessible ang clean energy, but
Yes.
I know through the years it's becoming more and more it's becoming cheaper, it's becoming more accessible. So hopefully nga,
Hopefully.
I am one with you, one with you with that with that hope. For my last one, hindi to talaga climate change, but it's more of I foresee that there will be more solutions journalism that will focus on curbing plastic pollution. Kasi plastic pollution is really becoming one of the most important issues next to climate change halos. And actually plastic pollution really is connected to the climate change issue, di ba? And given the Global Plastics Treaty na ngayon sisimulan na rin pag-usapan in the global scale, talagang I think there will be more solutions journalism. And personally, for Rappler, that is my hope and my dream na talagang maging solutions focused yung mga stories natin when it comes to the plastic pollution. So I really hope that that's the direction that the reporting on plastic pollution will go. Kasi we really need to have a solution to this problem. Yun yung sa akin. Meron ka pa
Yung
ba? O talagang
ano,
parehas tayo dun sa ano?
meron pa.
Okay, wow. O sige,
Meron pa.
go.
Actually, eto medyo confident ako. Hindi ko alam bakit. Pero
Wow.
as schools commence face-to-face classes, I would, uh, I think we'd see more young people joining climate organizations and being active in these organizations. Yan. Kasi nakita naman natin kahit na pandemic, even online, a lot of young people are joining spaces of discourses. And hindi naman naging hadlang yung online lang na setup for them to be active in these causes na talaga namang aapekto sa future nila. So I think ngayon na babalik tayo sa face-to-face at slowly nagiging normal yung sa pang-araw-araw natin. Nagiging physical na ang meetings, ang interactions natin. Ayun. I think there would be a lot more young people joining organizations, climate
Mhm.
organizations.
Agree ako dyan. Kasi knowing that actually it's their generation and the younger generations na, actually tayo rin naman, na
Our
really
generation,
mostly,
grabe naman,
our,
hindi naman tayo
okay, fine.
hindi
Our
naman tayo
generation, our generation, yung most affected talaga ng climate change. So that's why I think hindi lang siya basta pakul eh. Talagang it's really an urgency and we really feel it. We really, especially recent years, ramdam na talaga natin ang climate change. So I'd like to see more young people stepping up and really taking on the issue forward. Hindi lang basta para maging advocate ka. I mean, that's important, pero just to take the conversation forward. Kasi nga, sila rin naman yung mag-inherit ng planetang ito. Ayun! That's it for our last episode for 2022. Wow, we ended on in a hopeful note. Dahil kay Iya.
hopeful. No.
Hopeful note. That's it for our last episode for 2022. if you have questions and suggestions for future episodes for 2023, so you can reach Iya at sa Twitter at Iya Gozum. Okay? And ako naman, you can reach me on Twitter and Instagram at G Geronimo. See you next year and bye!
Bye. See you next year.